right, so last week we were talking about West Africa, but as it pertains to the transatlantic slave trade. So this week we're back into West Africa and talking about the civilizations that existed there up to the 18th century. Outside of, they're involved in the slave trade, but that's not our focus this week. So when we last left off talking about West Africa, we left off with the Songhai Empire. That was the last one that we talked about. So where does that go? Well, they reached the height of their power in the early 16th century. So remember, that means the 1500s. By that point in time, Islam had become more widely entrenched among the society. Trans-Saharan trade was flourishing, and the Saharan salt mines were brought within the boundaries of this empire, which, remember, is important because salt always was an important commodity for the Trans-Saharan trade. But eventually this empire too will fall. Its power was weakened by a succession of very short reigns and dynastic disputes. We know this as an ongoing problem with hereditary monarchies. You're not always getting the best ruler just because they happen to be the eldest son of the previous king, or they're next in line because of a family connection. Again, doesn't always make them the best king. So that's not something that's limited to this empire. They also had a series of civil wars that erupted in the 1580s. On top of all that, the general population and the agricultural basis of the economy was weakened by drought and disease. And again, that's something we've talked a lot about, and that you were to mention in your first essay, how these different societies interacted with their local environment, and how overplanting and overgrazing in terms of agriculture could negatively affect the entirety of the empire, because of course you need food in order to have a successful empire. Also, over time, there was a loosening control over the long-distance trade, the trans-Saharan trade, the control of that, the taxation of that, of course, being a huge source of their wealth. Now, again, we're talking about all of these different things with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, the weakening was gradual. It's not like all at once this happened. These things happened slowly over time, and it slowly weakened the empire from within and out. So eventually, this leads to the possibility of an invasion. In this case, it's going to be an invasion from the independent nation of Morocco. The main reason why they wanted to invade Songhai was to seize control of and revive the trans-Saharan trade in gold. So on March 21st of 1591, they are able to successfully use their superior firearms against the Songhai Empire. However, this invasion brought very little long-term financial reward for Morocco. Again, they were hoping to do what many other nations had done, and that's benefit from the control of the trans-Saharan trade. However, there was a persistent resistance that made it necessary for them to maintain an active army south of the Saharan desert. And this became a serious drain on resources. I mean, this is something that is always true no matter what time you're talking about. Maintaining an army and maintaining some sort of battle with another nation is very expensive. And so they really didn't see much of an economic benefit such as they hoped. Their pretense of acknowledging Moroccan authority ends in about 1660, and by the mid-18th century, so again the mid-1700s, Songhai had split into a number of different independent kingdoms, but is no longer this great and powerful empire as it once was. All right, so now we're going to the west of Songhai, talking about the Sultanate of Borno Kanem. So by the 11th century, the state of Kanem was a powerful force to the northeast of Lake Chad. And again, we're talking about to the east of Songhai. So Songhai would have been to the west, just to the west of the region that we're talking about, as you can see on the map there. They were able to gain wealth by raiding their neighbors and engaging in, surprise, surprise, the trans-Saharan trade. And much of their trading wealth from this trade was their exchange of captives for horses from North Africa, horses not being native to this region and having to be traded with Europe to get access to them. By the 13th century, a tributary state was established in Borno, so that's southwest of Lake Chad. By the 14th century, Kanem had declined and Borno began acting independently. So it was originally part of Kanem, and now it's acting independently of it as an independent nation. They also participated in trans-Saharan trade, trading directly across the desert, and also refusing to pay tribute to Kanem. And Kanem at this point was overstretched. They lacked the natural resources to maintain a large state, and again, they had dried off the land that was viable for agriculture, but through overgrazing. And so eventually, Kanem became a tributary state of Borno instead of it being the other way around. As Borno rose as the dominant part of Borno Kanem, they were able to strengthen their grip on the people of Borno. And they did this through considerable extortion of the peasantry. This means they had very harsh taxation, taking a lot of surplus crops for themselves. So unsurprisingly, they were shaken by a series of internal revolts from people who were not happy with being clearly extorted by their rulers. And these were very savagely put down to try to discourage any future revolt. Surprisingly, the outcome of that was that by the 17th to 18th centuries, it became a relatively peaceful empire and actually became the center of Islamic learning as that religion began to further develop in this region. Another group to emerge are going to be the Hausa city-states. They first emerged between about 1000 and 1200 CE. And they emerge as a civilization that is a mixture of South Saharan nomads and local farmers of the North Nigerian savannah. And their basic political unit was a compact walled village. So they're city-states. Many of you are history majors, so you probably remember at some point in time talking about the Greek city-states. So it's a lot like that. Each individual city-state is essentially independent. They are kind of loosely tied together as a federation, and they share some social and linguistic similarities. But again, each city-state is relatively its own little independent entity. And they were walled, these city-states, to protect against the South Saharan raiders. So even though over time the trans-Saharan trading is getting relatively more safe, that's not always the case. It's not like each time period we're talking about it's getting safer and safer. It's kind of gone back and forth. But there's still a lot of raiding that's going on, people wanting to seize wealth any way that they can. And so these cities were walled. Their economic basis was agriculture, manufacturing, and of course trade, given their location. If you look at the map over there on the right, you can see they're in that region that when we last talked about this being a region that was very well suited to take place and to participate in the trans-Saharan trade. And again, each city-state is really its own entity. They're loosely tied together culturally and linguistically, but each city-state had its own specialization as to what it really was known for producing. Slavery was very important in Hausa society, and they were used to build and maintain the city walls and to grow food. Their trading contacts across the trans-Saharan trade are going to introduce Islam to the ruling elite, but like a lot of the other civilizations that we have talked about and that we will talk about, it really remained largely the religion of the elite and didn't trickle down so much so to the general population. Again, that's an overstatement. Of course, there's always exceptions to that, but that generally tended to be the pattern. They're going to flourish from about the 16th to 18th century. Again, we're getting very close to colonization. We've only got 2 more chapters left. So this is really, we're talking about each region as it was at this point right before the period of colonization. There are going to be rivalries between the city-states, and so there's no one single Hausa empire. It's just, again, like I said, these little independent city-states that are loosely tied together by their social customs and their linguistics. Hausa will play an important role in the development of long-distance trade. We looked at the map there, and I mentioned before, they're in that region of West Africa that's ideally placed to take advantage of long-distance trade. However, as time goes on, there's going to be an increasing rivalry and rising levels of warfare between the city-states. And the warfare between them, warfare does, no matter where it is, devastates the countryside. And in order to pay for this war, the ruling class is going to overtax the peasantry, because again, armies and wars in general are very expensive, and so that money's got to come from somewhere. So to increase the supply of slaves, the ruling elite are going to start enslaving Muslim commoners. So if you remember, we've talked about this before, that it is against Sharia law, which is the religious law of the Islamic faith, to enslave a fellow Muslim. And so here they are acting against a common Muslim practice, that you don't enslave a fellow Muslim. And so by the 18th century, as people become more and more aware of this faith and they realize that, hey, this is against Sharia law, there's going to be a revolution against this practice, this holy revolution in the 19th century. So there's quite a bit of warfare going on. Again, remember, some of this is in part fueled by the demand for slaves by the Europeans in the transatlantic trade. So it's not the only cause, and we mentioned that before, it's not the only cause of these internal conflicts, but it certainly is helping to increase that, because war captives are going to be sold in many cases to the Europeans. All right. Talking about another West African society, this is going to be the Wolof. So the breakup of the Ghana Empire in the early 13th century, it's the 1200s, enables the Wolof-speaking people of the Senegambia region to form their own empire. And if you look at the map over there to the left, you can see it's located really close to the coast. So it shouldn't be surprising to hear that from the 17th to 18th centuries, they are heavily engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. And the numbers that they sent out weren't huge. We're talking about hundreds rather than thousands, but still they are engaging in the transatlantic slave trade, though many slaves are going to remain within their society as well, and they work to produce surplus foodstuffs for the royal court and coastal trading towns, because again, if you're engaged in the activities of the royal court, you're not able to grow your own food. But the Atlantic slave trade also creates a market for food to feed the slaves gathered at coastal trading towns. So remember, when slaves were captured and sold in the interior of Africa, they were then transported to the coast so that they could be taken across the Atlantic to the quote-unquote New World. Well, in the time in which they're waiting to get on the ship to be transported, they obviously need to be fed. And so this is one of the ways in which this kingdom grew wealthy, was to sell food to the coastal trading towns to feed the slaves that were waiting there for transportation. And because of this, their extensive trade, they become the dominant urban culture and language of the Senegambia region. All right, so now we're moving a little bit away from the coast and talking about, as they call it, the kingdoms of the forest. That's Ife and Benin. So the Yoruba form one of the larger language groups in the western part of modern Nigeria. And so the word Yoruba originates from the Hausa name for all people of the Oyo Empire. In modern usage, this refers to all people speaking the same language as the people of Oyo. So it's kind of confusing because we're talking about a lot of different people there, but basically the Yoruba is a language group, and it's a large one, and you really don't need to know much more than that. Historically, this kingdom is going to stretch from the savanna woodlands of the lower Niger into the forest towards the coast, and it's made up of a mix of farmers, hunters, and traders, or people who do engage in all. Eventually, there's a period of state formation from the 11th to 12th century, and the sources of the state authority were related to religion, and we know this to be a common form of justification for rulers, not just in Africa, but across the world, by tying religion and secular government together. They have more of, again, a rationalization for their rule. Their economic basis was their ability to produce a food surplus. We know that as being necessary for any long-term stable civilization, because you need to be able to feed the non-productive rulers, officials, courts, craftsmen, and artists. And the profit from their trade also was added to the taxation of the peasantry, which also paid for the royal court. So Ife was the original state, and it produced some of the finest artistic artifacts from the whole of West Africa. Their environment was very suitable for agriculture. And so because of this, because there was a lot of food surplus, many inhabitants had the time and the wealth to practice highly developed artistic skills. Because if you're just focused on subsistence, trying to find your next meal, you don't really have time to create art and other things. So we know that this was a highly stable civilization, at least when it came to food production. So south and east of Ife, we have the Edo-speaking people. They developed a centralized city-state at Benin. By the 15th century, it had transformed into a huge walled city. It developed a powerful standing army and expanded Benin into an expansive empire. So the Portuguese first come into contact with these people in the late 15th century, at the same time in which they're starting their exploration of the coast of Africa and trying to go all the way around the coast of Africa and enter into the Indian Ocean. We talked about that before. So when that gets started, they come into contact with these civilizations, and they are able to engage in a trade for captives. By the early 16th century, Benin expansion ended, and with it, its export of captives. By the 16th to 17th century, their main exports were pepper, ivory, gum, and cotton cloth. Because again, if they're not expanding anymore, they're not taking any war captives, and if they don't have any war captives, they don't have people to sell. So Benin doesn't make its reappearance into the Atlantic trade until the 18th century, 1700s, and the sale of its own citizens into slavery and the importation of firearms undermined its productive capacity and hastened its decline. And we talked about it in our last unit when we talked about the negative effect the Atlantic slave trade had on the African continent, the loss of the productive capacity of these different civilizations, because the people who are being sold are the youngest and most productive, because those are the people who are going to be in demand, and so they're not there producing in their homeland. That is a huge economic loss on top of of course, the human destruction that it causes. So that is going to be a problem. And the other thing to point out here is another theme that we mentioned last time, in that it's not like there was a steady stream of slaves being provided to the Atlantic slave trade, the European traders, like from each civilization. Like sometimes one civilization would be sending a whole lot of war captives, and then it might kind of die off, and then it might come back, such as the case here with Ife and Benin. Like they were sending a lot, and then they stopped expanding, so they weren't selling as many captives. And then there's another resurgence in the 18th century where they are selling more captives. So again, it's not like there was always captives being sold from the same regions over and over and over again. All right, so now we're going into the rise of Uyo. So Ife was the oldest and most senior of the Yoruba states, but it was soon surpassed in importance by the northern state of Oyo. This was founded in the 14th century. It was situated in the savanna woodland north of the tropical forest, also ideal for agriculture and in a strong trading position, as you can see over there to the map to the left. Their power and wealth grew in the 18th century, and again, not surprising given their location and their access to the coast. Their economic basis was the use of slave labor. They were used to work on royal farms to produce the agricultural surplus to supply the rest of the non-producers in the nation. Also, captives from warfare being used and sold. Other sources of income included tribute from the towns and villages in the kingdom. And of course, that all-powerful tax on transit trade. However, their incessant wars of expansion also produced more captives than they needed. So again, they could sell these to the Europeans for an additional profit. So if you recall, going back to our last unit, there was an enormous increase in demand in slaves in like the late 1700s. And because of this, Oyo became a major transit of slaves from the north to the south. However, I mean, is this the case with any kind of overdependence in the economy? I mean, if you're familiar with investments, you want to diversify your investments. You don't want to invest all your money in one thing, because what happens if that one thing stops, or that stock that you were invested in crashes? Like, that's not a good thing. So unfortunately for them, that's what they did. They developed an overdependence on the slave trade. And eventually, as time goes on, England and France started to reduce their trade in slaves. And eventually they ceased it altogether, outlawing slavery in their colonies. And that just led to, over time, the outlaw of slavery in other countries as well. And so that's a major loss of income for them. Because of that, royal authority declines. And the scene was set for a Muslim revolt in the early 19th century prior to colonization. All right, two more civilizations to talk about here. This is founded in the early 17th century. So royal power here was strengthened by the establishment of royal succession by primogeniture. So that just means primo, think of that as being like number one. The oldest son inherits everything. So there's no dividing of the kingdom. And what this meant was that traditional village chiefs didn't have a say in succession, and so that increased stability, because there's less of a disagreement about who the next king is going to be. It's going to be the oldest son of the king, and there's not going to be really any argument about it unless there is no son. That's the only downfall. If there is no son, then that's a problem. But other than that, as long as there's a son, the oldest one's going to inherit, and they're going to get everything. As a result, a cult of kingship developed, promoted by the introduction of annual human sacrifices. And these were usually victims taken captive in warfare, not members of their own society. Also, if you look at the map over there to the right, it's a repeat of a map I used before, but I like this one because it gives you an idea of a lot of the different civilizations that we're talking about. This is also on the coast, and so the kings were determined to exploit to the full the profits to be gained from the slave trade, which, remember, until slavery, the use of slaves starts to decline going into the 19th century, was hugely profitable. Firearms imported from the coast were usually exchanged for captives. We mentioned this before last time. Firearms were usually the number one item exchanged for slaves, though they weren't the only one. It's just the most popular. And because of this, Oyo and Dahomey became rivals for control over the coastal trade and captives. Oyo invaded 4 different times, and they were finally successful in the 1730s. Last kingdom we'll talk about are the Ashanti. So they were founded in the 1670s, and they were able to militarily conquer the surrounding chiefdoms, and that were originally just a loose grouping or federation of chiefdoms, and to encompass them into one empire. Their borders actually are going to expand to cover most of modern-day Ghana, and they also participated in the transatlantic slave trade, as did most kingdoms of this region. All right, so that is it for this one. You do have one more chapter to do this week, because we have to get caught back up, and that's chapter 14. So go ahead and watch that whenever you're able. Next week is just one more, so you're almost done. Again, we only have 15 chapters, so you're nearing the end here. So hang in there. Almost done. Finish the year strong.